Thanks very much. What I want to do is provide some context for Mike Marcus. His information there in speaker bios, you can find all about Mike. I'm not going to talk about his background, except as a regulator, and I want to provide some context for that. This is a short session, and you should consider it the wireless session at Freedom to Connect, and that this conference has been pretty much dominated by wireheads. Consider this to be the etherhead segment, okay? So, some disparaging things were said about wireless earlier today, and I don't really want to get into that, but I do want to point out the fact that as I look out to all you with your laptops, you're not jacked into Ethernet here, okay? You're doing things in the ether. So there's a little bit more to this wireless story that, if you give it some thought, there's some fine points there that really need to be discussed. Anyway, look, earlier today we had one of the founding fathers of the internet here, Vint Cerf, and there's been this discussion about who's a founding father, who isn't, who's the grandpa of the internet, whatever. But those are scientists and engineers. But when we talk about, we bring in regulators and politicians, what happens is you get like the Al Gore thing, which generates raucous laughter, okay, in terms of what his role was in the founding of the internet. Well, regulators do have a place, particularly they've had a place in wireless, okay? And what I want to do is sort of provide some context for Mike and sort of like going back and into the historical record and look at what happened during the Carter administration when an attempt was made to deregulate the rules that the FCC was using to regulate the radio spectrum. Carter appointed a guy named Chuck Ferris to be the chairman of the commission, and he brought people like Mike in to bring this into place. Now, what this was about was trying to say, look, regulators or regulation is deemed to be bad, so what can we do to get the regulator out of the loop in terms of coming up with a set of rules that would be minimalist and that wouldn't stand in the way of innovation, okay? So they embarked on this to try to solve this challenge, and what came out in 1981 was a notice of inquiry that set the stage for using this new technology called spread spectrum to allow a concept called spectrum overlay, essentially where you would now use spread spectrum to overlay existing services and not cause interference, okay? So this was a pretty heady concept for that time. It proceeded to a notice of proposed rulemaking in 1984, and finally in 1985, the rules came out, the Part 15 rules that we know and are in use today and which you're using in the technology that's embedded in your laptops. But if you look back at what was originally proposed, and in fact what was in the notice of proposed rulemaking in 1984 and what came out 1 year later, it's like different like night and day, all right? So Mike was there at the commission in the late 70s, and I would call him, again, because his work affected me as an entrepreneur, in that in the early 90s, there were two companies that, Metrocom and my company, Tetherless Access, that took these unlicensed rules and tried to come out with products. So Metrocom used what was called frequency hopping spread spectrum to produce a set of products. They were going for wireless data transmission. My company, Tetherless Access, went with direct sequence spread spectrum, and we were trying to do wireless internet, so higher speeds, right? There were a number of other companies during the 90s that were formed using either frequency hopping or direct sequence spread spectrum. Now you've heard like Hedy Lamarr had a role in being the progenitor of frequency hopping spread spectrum. There's a new biography out about Hedy and her work in that field. Okay, what you don't see are books or even a TV documentary about the regulators, okay? So what I'm trying to do here is to pay homage to people like Mike, those unseen people that were at the right place in the right time to provide a tipping point for something that's generated something that none of us could even at that time predict, okay? Metricom went public, my company went public during the 90s, but all the public companies, wireless internet companies, by 2000, we were all gone. In fact, you've never heard of my company, Tetherless Access. Some of you may have heard of Metricom. But we used the spread spectrum technology, and it didn't catch on. So we paid the price for that, okay? Until in the 2000 decade, a new technology came in to do wireless data, okay, that wasn't based on spread spectrum. But that's a more detailed story, but it's like path not taken. But the thing is, what started this whole thing going was the work of people like Mike, those regulators, those unsung regulators, who paid the price for that regulatory innovation. Mike paid a personal price in his career because he stuck to his guns about this approach of essentially minimal set of rules and don't stand in the way of innovation. This was really radical at the time, and it's hard for you to look back maybe and see how radical that was, but look at what it's generated now, okay? So without work like his and other people that were part of that era, and then people like, you know, that took it and made products out of it, you know, us entrepreneurs during the decade of the 1990s, you wouldn't have what you have here today, okay? So regulation for wireless is, I hope we can get back to those simplistic rules of like, what we've got now is a pretty complicated soup. But if we're going to get back to those pretty revolutionary ideas of the early 80s, I think we need to, like what we're doing now with you wireheads looking at broadband, okay, wireless broadband needs to take a different direction. So without further ado, the guy who I think is the father of wireless internet, or the father of what you have there today in terms of wireless, is Mike Marcus.
Thank you. Although let me say, Vic Hayes is a close friend of mine, and Vic Hayes is also called the father of the internet. And Vic Hayes, as I'll explain later, and I did complementary things, and we are good friends and exchange email once a week. So let me not take away any of Vic's. Sorry. Okay, what we're going to talk about today is where did Wi-Fi come from, and notice on the bottom of these slides I talk about technology and regulation, because communications is a very highly regulated area, and for better or for worse, innovation and regulation are closely related. But the story of what happened in the 80s was a bipartisan political movement for deregulation, removed the roadblocks that kept a new technology in Pandora's box, and we saw where it went. This is not where we expected it to go to, but not that we opposed to going there. There was a view in the late 70s, early 80s that if you deregulated, you would get economic growth, and it certainly happened. And serendipity and some unexpected consequences gave us today's Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and other useful niche applications. Zigbee is not a household name at the moment, but may be a household name in the next couple years. Okay, since everyone here seems to be wired, let's explain briefly why wireless is different. 100 years ago last month, the Titanic sank. Most of spectrum regulation in the US and the world is a direct consequence of the Titanic sinking, and to some degree the concepts haven't been updated since Titanic sinking. Many spectrum regulators resemble Soviet economic planners, projecting demands and predicting and allocating resources. I frankly think that NTIA is the most Soviet-like agency in the US government, because what NTIA seems to do is act as if it were the former Soviet Gosplan. Classically, this system gives little attention to entrepreneurs, disruptive innovation, and niche applications. And as I'll show you in a minute, Wi-Fi started as two niche applications, not a mainstream killer app. The birth of unlicensed in the U.S. The U.S. 1934 Act doesn't mention unlicensed at all. Indeed, the ARRL, the Amateur Radio Group, believes that unlicensed is illegal. But the first system for unlicensed was this one. This picture comes from the Hedy Lamarr book, by the way. That was a 1930s Philco remote control system for a radio. Who knew radios needed remote control? But Philco figured it out in the 30s. And the FCC, when confronted with this request, decided since it was unlikely to cause interference, why not? Subsequent legislation has mentioned unlicensed, but never has explicitly authorized it. So that one license was a bad stepchild. Unlicensed has been controversial around the world, and here's an odd device called an iTrip. It's an attachment for your iPhone or iPod that lets you connect to an FM radio. This has been authorized in the US for 40 or 50 years, these types of low-power things, but in many countries it's been forbidden. And indeed, that thing in the lower left-hand corner is a press release from the UK regulator 3 years ago saying they were finally going to allow it, but it's not allowed in most parts of Europe. So there's a very, very different view of unlicensed in the US, where it's been allowed since the late 30s, than in Europe, which has a very much more prescriptive way of doing things. Traditional spectrum policy is best typified by GSM. It prioritizes uses of spectrum. It picks winners and losers. And Europe Incorporated picked GSM as a winner and forbid all other cellular technologies in Europe other than GSM. Similarly, Europe Incorporated also forbids all types of cordless phones except one type of cordless phone. This is the European mentality. Whether it's good or bad, that's the way things are. That has been very different in the US. Bluetooth and Wi-Fi come from a very different background than GSM. And particularly, I like to say, rather than Gosplan, that's the Gosplan building on the left side, it came from the Field of Dreams theory. Field of Dreams theory, in my view, is if you allow it, it will come. And Field of Dreams had a big influence on me, and it was the faith in deregulation of getting out of the way of technology, even if you don't know where it goes, what led to Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. We gave people a blank slate for doing that. Spread spectrum was implicitly forbidden in the US and every place else in the world because it went against all the concepts that went back to the Titanic. The Carter era FCC wanted to get rid of regulation that held back technology, and spread spectrum was the initial thing we were doing on. Spread spectrum was the justification for Wi-Fi and the core of Wi-Fi until 802.11g finally came in, and indeed it still is the basis of Bluetooth. The legendary Hedy Lamarr, in the book I'm sort of quoted disagreeing with her. Hedy Lamarr is the inventor of Wi-Fi, of spread spectrum, in the same way that Charles Babbage is the inventor of the computer. Charles Babbage and Leda Ada Lovelace were pioneers in computer hardware and software. So was Hedy Lamarr in spread spectrum. Do today's computers come directly from Charles Babbage? No. Does Windows come from Ada Lady Lovelace? No. She was a pioneer. Charles Babbage was a pioneer. Hedy Lamarr was a pioneer. Okay. She indeed did get a patent. That's the patent there. It was never reduced to practice. Spread spectrum, for those of you who aren't wireless techies, comes in two flavors, the so-called direct sequence pseudo-noise flavor and the frequency hopping flavor. Her patent was on the frequency hopping side. Bluetooth is a frequency hopping system. Wi-Fi never was. But you know, the two flavors, CDMA cell phones are a DSPN, just like Wi-Fi was originally. This, frankly, I think is the first real spread spectrum system. This was Paul Green's doctoral thesis at MIT Lincoln Lab. He is best known for his later career working as an IBM researcher, but that is the earliest system. In 1953, it was a quite clunky system. In the early literature, almost everything was classified. I first even learned about this technology in a 1972 conference when I was in the military, and if you wanted to learn about it, the only thing was a secret textbook that Sylvania had written for NSA. In 1975, this book came out. This book is still in print. I would strongly recommend it if you want to read about the technology. It is mathematically inelegant, but it's a very good discussion of what's going on in the area, and it indeed was the first introduction of many people to the area. 1979, when I joined the FCC, this was the status of spread spectrum. This was a clunky $20,000, $30,000 box that Magnavox made for civil uses. It was a version of an Air Force system. The Japanese regulator bought a copy, tested it, and decided it had no practical civil use. Okay. The profits of deregulation, never thought you'd see these people here, but Jimmy Carter hired Alfred Kahn. Alfred Kahn was a Cornell professor who later became the last head of the Civil Aeronautics Board, was the profit of deregulation. And when Reagan came in, he continued many of these things, even though he denied he ever heard them from anybody else. But that's okay. Charles Ferris, who was previously just mentioned, took Kahn's concepts and Carter's mandate to be more specific. He said, let's find technologies that are being held back. He hired Steve Lukasik, former director of ARPA, the man who signed his name on the check that paid for the ARPANET. He was the one who Larry Roberts, who was Vince's boss, went to get the money for the ARPANET. Steve Lukasik came to FCC, hired me, and we decided that spread spectrum was the technology we wanted. When the election came and Reagan came in, Ferris went out the door, Mark Fowler came in. He perhaps was not the most technically sophisticated person around, but he agreed that getting rid of outdated regulations was fully consistent with the Reagan agenda. And that bottom quote there in a conference 4 years ago was that this was probably one of the most significant achievements of the Reagan FCC, although I did not think so at the time. Actually, he tried to fire me shortly after that at the time, but okay, I forgive him. He said something nice 4 years ago. The early FCC action, we paid $70,000 for MITRE Corporation report saying, how can we use this technology? And actually, it was in this report that first suggested the idea of unlicensed spread spectrum in the ISM bands. So we must give credit to MITRE for that. Interesting, since then, FCC has never had money to pay for this type of report, which I think is an interesting lesson learned. We started in 1981. That's a picture of how much hair I had in 1981, with two proposals, one dealing with general use, one dealing with amateur radio use. Hewlett-Packard, but actually the part which is now called Agilent, was supportive, almost everyone was against. IEEE, my professional society, was in favor. In 1985, that's how much hair I had. These videos are actually on YouTube if you absolutely run out of things to do. That's the FCC decision that was made in 1985. 1 watt limit. Almost any application. We frankly anticipated it would be for a wide variety of niche applications. There was no explicit mention of anything vaguely resembling Wi-Fi in there. 2 years later, I wrote a paper where I mentioned something that's Wi-Fi-like. We didn't know where this was going, but we didn't care where it was going. We wanted to unleash technology and stimulate economic growth, and we succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. 1988, this was the first commercial product. This was a Wi-Fi-like device. It was a 900 megahertz band. It was a proprietary device by a Canadian company, but it was the first radio local area network that was mass-produced. 802.11 came from a joint venture of 3 companies: NCR, Intersil, a device manufacturer, Symbol Technologies, best known for those supermarket scanners at your supermarket. They were interested in 2 niche applications. One was wireless cash registers. The other one was portable bar scanners for warehouses where they could do inventory control, which turned out to revolutionize the warehouse business, I'm told. Okay, Vic Hayes, who's shown there on the right with me, from NCR's lab in Holland, because it turned out no one in mainstream NCR knew anything about wireless, and their lab in Holland led the standardization effort, and is the one often attributed also as the father of Wi-Fi. It was interesting, in 1991, many of us went to this conference in the woods in Quebec, and the title of the conference was Spread Spectrum, Potential Commercial Applications, Myth or Reality. So in 1991, people weren't sure whether this was going to go anywhere. I met a lot of great friends at this meeting who we still keep in touch with. But this is the numerical growth. On the left side is not number of units, it's number of different models that were approved by FCC. But on the right is number of units, and it's fascinating to me that we're selling over 1 billion Wi-Fi units a year at the moment. But the demand really, really took off, much to my surprise. Unexpected uses of Wi-Fi. Vic and I exchange email from time to time on what's new in the Wi-Fi business. Well, municipal use of Wi-Fi, certainly we didn't anticipate, but that's not a great surprise to people here. Here's one you may not be aware of. I have a boat. Many marinas that I go to, that red circle is a Wi-Fi sign on the ramp there. Many marinas now have Wi-Fi for visiting boaters, extremely useful. One of my favorites is Wi-Fi bathtub. You ever need a Wi-Fi bathtub? But it has underwater speakers, and it's a Wi-Fi connection between your iPod to the underwater speakers, in this case mainly for electrical safety. When you have water, you have to be very careful of electrical safety. The supermarket scanner, when you fill your shopping cart, you scan all the devices, and when you get to the cash register, it's already been totaled. I find that, who would have thought that? These are 15249 is not Wi-Fi. It's a section of the rules that's sort of Wi-Fi light, but when you get a wireless keyboard, a wireless mouse, or if your electric or gas meter have a wireless link, it's almost always a 15249 link, which is not the same rules, but is a logical successor to that. Here is the team that brought you this, the FCC team did that, who Chairman Fowler tried to fire almost all of them, but you know, he changed his mind, so he was under a lot of pressure at the time. Let me talk about some of the lessons learned. You may recall that a decade or so ago, .com was, we talk about .com era, .com in your name was seen as a magic elixir of success. There are some people who view unlicensed or 802 as a magic elixir of success. There have been other unlicensed technologies, some of which had broad industry support, that have had little success. And unlicensed PCS, UNII, ultra-wideband, and the European Hyperland all had industry support as opposed to spread spectrum, the basis of Wi-Fi, that basically nobody was in favor of. These all had much greater industry support and went nowhere, almost nowhere. Wi-Fi unlicensed is not a guarantee of success. Particularly unlicensed with detailed regulations may not be able to adapt to meet demands. The reason I think Wi-Fi was successful was the underlying rules were only half a page in the FCC rulebook and had a great deal of technical flexibility to enable it to evolve to meet new demands. The 802 of today is very, very different than the 802 of 1990. And 802 doesn't like to talk about it, but its attempts to standardize UWB were not successful. It did standardize 802.16 WiMAX, but that's had mixed success for various reasons. One of the reasons I think Wi-Fi was successful is when it was introduced, there had been several years of non-standard products, and those non-standard products gave people an opportunity to both understand what the market was and to understand how technology worked in the real world. And I'm somewhat troubled that as soon as a new opportunity comes available, everyone rushes together in an 802 meeting and said, let's standardize all in one thing, when people don't know what the market is or how technology works in the real world. And I think that's the reason why 802's batting average is not as good today as it used to be. So my conclusions are, this started at White House directed deregulation to stimulate economic growth. It was bipartisan, started under Carter. It continued under Reagan. It was a major break from the classical Soviet style planning of radio spectrum. The deregulatory concepts grew into a worldwide market, but what's particularly important is the synergy of unlicensed and regulatory flexibility. Google commissioned a report by Professor Milgram last year that said unlicensed is the greatest thing since sliced bread. Let me say I disagree with Professor Milgram on that. Unlicensed can be very, very successful, but when you combine unlicensed with detailed regulations, it's no magic elixir of success. And I have a website, I have a blog, feel free to surf on over to it, and I'd be glad to answer any questions if we have any time left, which we might.
Okay, I think we should move on. Thank you very much, Michael. This is really important work, it comes off as geeky, but or the Office of Engineering and Technology, and could push one agenda item at the commission, what would it be?
Well, in self-serving, I have a client in the TV whitespace business, but the problem with TV whitespace business is it's stock at 04186. 04 was 8 years ago. TV whitespace, which the chairman calls super Wi-Fi, whether it's super Wi-Fi is debatable. There's a minor problem. Wi-Fi is a trademark of somebody. But the fact that they've spent 8 years, and while they like to think it's finished, it isn't. The only 3 places you can use TV whitespace are 3 obscure rural areas. FCC has to be more decisive, has to finish the TV whitespace docket to at least let the products sink or swim on their own merits, and also has to tell the technical community we are not going to spend 8 years screwing around with technical rulemakings. The FCC, there was a lot of discussion of Comcast. The Comcast-NBC merger was disposed of in 1 year. The AT&T T-Mobile merger was disposed of in 1 year. These mergers are complex. The technical problems, TV whitespace, are complex. There is no rational justification that they could deal with the AT&T Comcast merger in 1 year, and yet 8 years going in TV whitespace, they haven't been able to deal with it. There are some basic infrastructure problems at FCC on the technical side that preclude them from. They have to be more decisive on spectrum management issues, and a good place to start is to finish the TV whitespace issue and let the devices sink or swim on their own merits.
And what's holding it up?
They have not, I don't know if it's politics, I think a lack of enthusiasm, a lack of resources. There are details of it that they still haven't finished, and as a result, if someone could mass produce TV whitespace, they couldn't sell it, and therefore nobody can get the capital to do it. But there is a need for FCC to be more decisive one way or other in its spectrum policy decisions.
Okay, thank you. One more question.
Quick question. Kathy Kleiman, and I just wanted to let everyone know that Michael Marcus is my hero. He probably doesn't remember me, but in the mid-1990s, I had a client named 3Com that was developing a technology that no one knew anything about called wireless local area networks. And it was a spread spectrum technology, and the FCC was about to auction off the spectrum. And we went to Michael Marcus, and he listened. And the FCC eventually listened, and we saved the spectrum. And I'm sure you've heard a little bit about wireless LAN since. What people do in the regulatory environment, so many of us work in the unregulated environment, but the people in the regulatory environment who have opened up the spectrum for innovation and for Part 15 for unlicensed use, definitely my heroes, because they paved the way for what we're doing today. So thank you, Michael.
Okay, thank you. Okay, that's good. Okay.